This is the Sleepless Historian, weaving history's whispers for restless nights. Join our journey at Historica, share the calm, subscribe, and drift deeper into the past. In the 250 years after the Babylonian king Hammurabi died in 1750 BCE, the Near East changed a great deal. And by 1500 BCE, new peoples, speaking languages called Hittite, Hurrian, and Kassite, were playing important roles. There were big, new imperial kingdoms and capital cities. Yet the whole region was also coming out of a mysterious dark age about 100 years long, when it appears few records were kept. This dark age is fascinating, an era that leaves us with more questions than answers. What we know is that the lands that dominated the Near East at the end of this era inherited many traditions of the Old Babylonian period, while also making a lot of changes. Let's look at the Kassites first. They were immigrants who were mentioned periodically through 5 generations and 150 years with Hammurabi's successors. We can't be sure where the Kassites came from. Some scholars think they came from the mountains northeast of Mesopotamia, though that's debated. But a dynasty of Kassite kings took control in southern Mesopotamia and had a remarkably successful regime that lasted centuries. Still, the Kassites are puzzling. Their language is unlike any other Mesopotamian tongue. At least what we know of it. They didn't write down their language, so we can't tell much about it. Kassite scribes learned the cuneiform writing system in Mesopotamian schools and used it to write the local Akkadian and Sumerian languages rather than their own Kassite. The only things that seem to have been written in their own language were personal names and gods' names. A lot of their names end in the sound ash. The names of some of their kings show this. Abiratash, Bornaboriash, Dundash, Karahardash, Keshtiliash, and the list goes on. These names are distinctive and clearly not native to Mesopotamia. Then there were the Hittites. They lived in what is now Turkey, ancient Anatolia, and they were the inheritors of the Anatolian civilization that had existed for hundreds of years in that region. The Hittites' ancestors had traded with the Assyrians of northern Mesopotamia for textiles and tin, providing silver in exchange. Hittite was one of the Indo-European family of languages, so it's related to English, German, French, Latin, and so on, as well as to some Indian languages like Sanskrit. Hittite was the earliest Indo-European language to be written down, but people must have been speaking related Indo-European languages for thousands of years before the beginning of writing. The Hittites adopted the cuneiform writing system late in the Old Babylonian period, around maybe 1650 BCE, and unlike the Kassites, they did use it to write their own language. A third new powerful group of people spoke Hurrian, which wasn't Semitic or Indo-European, and wasn't related to Sumerian either. In other words, like Kassite, Hurrian wasn't related to the dominant languages of Mesopotamia, but it had been spoken in northern Syria for centuries. Hittites, Hurrians, and Kassites are all mentioned in texts from the later years of Hammurabi's dynasty, though they weren't playing major roles just yet. Hammurabi had built an empire that extended north beyond what is now the border between Iraq and Syria. The kingdom of Mari in the eastern part of Syria seems to have marked the northern limit of this empire, and Hammurabi's successors struggled to maintain it. While dealing with rebellions, Hammurabi's son lost a lot of land to the south of Babylon, but he was victorious against a Kassite incursion. When he chose the name for his 9th year on the throne, he commemorated this victory. Still, during the years leading up to 1595 BCE, the Babylonian Empire shrank considerably. After the end of Hammurabi's empire, we're confronted with something of a mystery. Mesopotamian scholars are dependent on cuneiform texts to provide us with evidence of the historical events of each era. If tablets aren't found in the ground, we simply can't know what was going on. And that's just the situation for the 16th century BCE. in Mesopotamia and in Syria, very few documents have been discovered that can be dated to the period from 1595 to 1500 BCE. It's a classic dark age. It's as though someone drew a curtain over almost a whole century. Without documents, we end up without much to say, and a lot of questions unanswered. By the end of this dark age, so many things had changed. It wasn't just that the Kassites were now ruling Mesopotamia. There were also two powerful new empires in the north. The Hittite Empire was growing in Anatolia, and an empire called Mitanni, dominated by the Hurrians, was expanding across northern Mesopotamia and Syria. By 1500 BCE, even the Egyptians had become imperialistic. Previously, they had largely kept to the Nile Valley, but now they started campaigning in the Levant. So, how did everything change? I'd like to take you through these mysteries by looking at them through the perspective of a kingdom I know well, though you might not have ever heard of it. It was called Hana, and it was one of the few kingdoms that seems to have managed to survive from the later years of Hammurabi's dynasty through the Dark Age and into the time of the new empires that followed. Hana was centered on the city of Terka, on the Euphrates River in Syria. In the time of the Old Babylonian kingdom of Mari, during the 18th century BCE, Terka was one of Mari's provincial capitals. But it had already been a major city for hundreds of years. Way back in the 23rd century BCE, which was the time of Sargon, ruler of the Akkadian Empire, Terka was a major city with a huge city wall and an important temple to the god of this region. His name was Dagon. I worked on the archaeological excavation at Terka when I was in graduate school, and when I picked a topic for my doctoral dissertation, it was an obvious choice to focus on this fascinating ancient Hana kingdom that once thrived there. Right away, I was struck by a fascinating puzzle. 10 different kings were named in clay tablets from Hana. They were dated using the year names of these kings. All 10 of the kings were local, but no one was quite sure of the order of their reigns. I decided to try to give the whole kingdom a basic timeline by putting the kings in order. Figuring out the correct sequence was a form of detective work. I looked at lots of details. The language had changed gradually over time, and so had the style of the script. Things like the position of cylinder seals, the width of the margins, and the size and shape of the tablets. These were features that the scribes altered gradually. I found that by analyzing these clues and observing the gradual stages in the changes, I could put the tablets in order. It helped, too, that a couple of kings gave their fathers names, and that several generations of the same private families showed up in some of the documents. We already knew that at least some of the kings ruled during the Old Babylonian period. A French scholar named Olivier Rouault realized that one of the Hana kings was named in a Babylonian year name from the time of Hammurabi's son, so that Hana king was obviously contemporary with the reign of Hammurabi's son. Almost all the historians who had studied the Hana texts up through the late 1980s had believed the Hana kingdom existed before Hammurabi's empire ended in 1595 BCE, that is, before the Dark Age began, but they thought it hadn't continued afterwards. A huge new clue appeared when a German scholar published a Hana text that was in a private collection. It contained distinctive phrases from the Hana region and was a lot like one of the tablets I had put at the end of the sequence. Scholars had thought those phrases had been only used in the Old Babylonian period. But this new tablet was dated almost 500 years after Hammurabi's reign and 350 years after the end of the Old Babylonian period. The newly published tablet didn't have a year name of a Hana king. The date on the contract was in the reign of a known king of Assyria who ruled from 1244 to 1208 BCE. I remember getting goosebumps as I read the German scholar's article. Some of those Hana tablets that I had been working on must have been much closer in time to this later text, and therefore they were written much later than I'd anticipated. there were close parallels between a few of them and the text in the private collection. They really couldn't have been written much more than 50 years earlier. So, that meant that the Harna kings I'd carefully put in order based on these subtle changes in the way scribes wrote the tablets. They hadn't ruled within 150 years of one another, but rather across the span of 500 years. And that meant some of them might have ruled during the enigmatic Dark Age. In other words, the Kingdom of Harna might help answer some of the big questions about this fascinating era. And I believe it has done that. Well, sort of. The biggest problem is that there are still only a few dozen cuneiform tablets from Harna that we know of. We now have the names of 18 local kings and a pretty good sense of the order of their reigns. But for most of the kings' reigns, only one or two documents have been found. Imagine if you were trying to understand all of American history since about 1500 and you had maybe 60 documents to go on. And most of these were records of people buying and selling houses. You would be missing a lot. So we're missing a lot about Harna. Perhaps, somewhere in the ground in Syria, there are royal archives for Harna, like the ones at Mari, with thousands of undiscovered cuneiform tablets. These could be treaties, diplomatic letters, administrative texts, or omens. And perhaps someday someone will find them and will have answers to so many of our questions. But that hasn't happened yet. So, for now, here's some of what we know about Harna and how it fits into the big picture. After Hammurabi's reign, and just to the north of his imperial border, some local kings ruled Harna, which was about the same size as Mari's old kingdom and included much of the same territory. And these kings ruled from Terka, their capital. We know from contracts and letters found in the houses that life in Terka at this time was a lot like life in Hammurabi's empire. People bought and sold houses and fields. They lived near their relatives. They farmed and took out loans. They worshipped gods in local shrines. And during the reign of Hammurabi's son, Samsu-iluna, they seem to have been attacked by the Babylonian forces. We only know this because Samsu-iluna wrote about it. There's no evidence for the attack in Terka itself. Maybe his victory was short-lived. Afterwards, a king with a foreign name took the throne at Terka. He was named Keshtiliashu. This is definitely a Kassite name. But it was about 200 years after this that the Kassites took control of Babylon. So on this basis, lots of historians have speculated that Terka was home to a Kassite kingdom ruled by Keshtiliashu, while Hammurabi's successors were still ruling in Babylon. But those historians must be wrong. I say this because among all the names in the Harna contracts that survived from his time, Keshtiliashu had the only Kassite name. Everyone else had Amorite and Akkadian names. If this had been a Kassite kingdom, you would expect at least some other Kassite people to have lived there besides the king. My guess is that he was a local king who admired the Kassites and took the name of one of their war leaders. After all, the Kassites had recently been giving trouble to the king of Babylon, and the people of Harna probably supported them, since they also fought against Babylon. By 1650 BCE, just a few decades after the reign of Keshtiliashu, there was a new threat on the horizon. Maybe the people of Harna were aware of it. Traveling north up the Euphrates from Terka, you'd come to the kingdom of Yamhud, with its capital city of Aleppo, in Syria. Quite suddenly, it seems, around 1630 BCE, Aleppo was attacked from the north by a Hittite king and his troops. Yamhud was able to repulse the attacks, but the people there would no doubt have worried, would the Hittites come back? The Hittites seem not to have been a concern to the people of Mesopotamia before, but this Hittite king was more aggressive than previous kings had been. He'd already brought a lot of the Anatolian plateau under his control, and now he was eyeing the rich Mesopotamian kingdoms. The next Hittite king tried again to conquer Aleppo, and, unlike his father, he was successful. A later inscription described it this way: he went to the city of Aleppo, destroyed Aleppo, and brought Aleppo's deportees and its goods to Hattusa. That was the Hittite capital. This must have been a terrifying time for the Mesopotamians and the Assyrians. They were familiar with one another's kingdoms. They fought one another from time to time, but they understood the rules of combat and the reasons for the battles. They also had diplomatic relationships and treaties. But what to make of the Hittites? They weren't part of the diplomatic system. Hana wasn't that far away from Yamhad, so the people there almost certainly had heard about the Hittite attacks on Aleppo. And the next move by the Hittites changed Near Eastern history. The same king who destroyed Aleppo now launched an offensive right down the Euphrates. Unfortunately, we don't know almost any of the details. No one at the time wrote anything about it, though it was remembered later. It was the attack that brought an end to Hammurabi's dynasty. A later Hittite royal inscription describes the episode in just 2 sentences. Now, later, he, the Hittite king, went to Babylon and fought the Hurrian troops. Babylon's deportees and its goods he kept in Hattusa. That's the Hittite capital again. The last of Hammurabi's successors, Samsu-Datana, disappears from history at this point. We also know that the Hittites stole the statue of the Babylonian city god Marduk and the statue of the god's wife Sarpanatum from their glorious temples and took them away, probably also to Hattusa. What the Hittite king didn't do was to set up a government in the kingdom of Babylon. He raided the city, presumably destroyed lots of buildings, and went back home, taking the statues of the city gods with him. He left a power vacuum behind. Now we know that the Kassites ended up filling this power vacuum, but how did they do so? Historians have been wondering about this for decades. Another clue about this era comes from a fascinating Kassite text. Suzanne Paulus, who's a historian at the University of Chicago, published it in 2014. In this document, other groups of peoples, not the Hittites, are credited with causing problems for Samsu-Datana, the last king of the Babylonian dynasty. It suggests that the people of Harna, Hanaans, along with the Kassites, and another group of people called the Amorites, staged an uprising that might well have taken place before the Hittite attack. The inscription says, "When at the time of Samsu-Datana, the borders of Sumer and Akkad were altered by the belligerence of the Amorites, the uprising of the Hanaans, and the army of the Kassites. The design of the land had been obliterated and its borders unmade." Perhaps Babylon was severely weakened from these rebellions before the Hittites were even involved. If so, the Kassites might already have been positioned to take power when the Hittites retreated back to their homeland. In any event, it's fairly clear from this inscription that the kingdom of Harna was not on Babylon's side and might have helped the Hittites in their campaign. So, with the conquest of Babylon in 1595 BCE, we enter the Dark Age that I've been talking about. It's not until around 1450, 150 years later, that cuneiform documents started being written again in any significant numbers. And by then, the Kassite dynasty had been ruling central Mesopotamia for ages. Around the same time, we get documents from the new Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni in the north. So what happened? Well, there's one inscription that supposedly tells us something about what was going on right towards the beginning of the Kassite dynasty during the Dark Age. The inscription is credited to a king named Agum, and that was the name of an early Kassite king. We know this because the later kings kept lists of their ancestors, and Agum was on the list. The problem with this inscription is that it's known from a much, much later copy, and some scholars think that was a fake made by a later king to justify his control of certain lands. But it could also be a genuine copy of an inscription from the time of Agum. And for several reasons, I'm inclined to believe that. There are some details in the inscription that later scribes almost certainly wouldn't have known about. Anyway, what this Kassite king, Agum, celebrates in his inscription is the fact that he has brought about the return of the statues of the god Marduk and his divine wife to Babylon. This would have been a huge achievement and a way to convince the Babylonians to view him as a true successor to the dynasty of Hammurabi. When the statues were away in the land of the Hittites, the Babylonians would have felt that their city was missing its gods. A king who could bring them back must have had the gods' support. Meanwhile, the Hittites would have been respectful to the Babylonian statues while they had them. Like the Mesopotamians, the Hittites thought the gods lived inside their statues, and they definitely would have believed in the power of Marduk. We know that when the Hittites captured divine statues, they kept them as hostages in temples, but they also kept up their care and feeding. You didn't want to annoy a foreign god, so I'm sure they did the same for Marduk and his wife Tzarpanatum. The Hittites wouldn't have damaged the statues, and the Babylonians would have been desperate to get them back. What the Kassite king Argham of Babylon says he did was to send an ambassador to negotiate for the return of the statues. His negotiations were successful, and arrangements were made for the statues to be returned. Here's a curious thing, though. He didn't say that this embassy went to the Hittite capital. What he says is, and I quote, "I sent to a far-off land, to the land of the Hanaans, and Marduk and Tzarpanatum did they conduct to me." So the statues came back not from the land of the Hittites, but from the land of the Hanaans, Hana. Unfortunately, we don't know which of the Hana kings was involved in these negotiations, but the inscription seems to confirm the idea that Hana continued to thrive during the Dark Age, since Argham lived during that time. One striking thing about this episode is that the Kassite king Argham used long-distance diplomacy to get the statues back. And he probably initially had to negotiate with the Hittites. This is true even if, as he said, the statues ended up coming back from Hana, which was partway between the Hittite capital and Babylon. The Hittites hadn't been part of the diplomatic network up to this point, but afterward they took to diplomacy in a big way. The Hittites adopted all the diplomatic techniques that the Mesopotamians and Assyrians had developed over hundreds of years. They used messengers, treaties, diplomatic letters, gifts, dynastic marriages, the whole thing. Maybe this interaction between the Hittites, the Kassite king Argham, and the Hana king, whoever he was at the time, was the impetus that brought the Hittites into the Near Eastern diplomatic world. Their negotiation over the divine statues was a precursor to the next great era, which would come to be dominated by diplomacy rather than warfare, but that was still decades off in the future. Still hidden in the darkness of the Dark Age are the beginnings of another great new power, the kingdom of Mitanni. Mitanni dominated northern Mesopotamia for about 150 years, starting around 1500 BCE. It had a largely Hurrian-speaking population. By the end of the Dark Age, Mitanni was a powerful empire, ruling an area that eventually stretched about 500 miles from east to west, from the eastern edge of northern Iraq across much of Syria to what is now southeast Turkey. We don't know how it began. One problem in the study of Mitanni is that its capital city hasn't been excavated yet, though scholars are pretty sure where it was located. We have only a few documents that name the Mitannian kings, and, as in the case of Hana, the sequence and dates of the kings aren't understood properly yet. It's just possible that Hana will again help with this puzzle. A handful of contracts found in Terka include references to kings who have similar names to the early kings of Mitanni. Does this mean that these are the earliest known Mitannian texts? Possibly not. The documents don't mention the land of Mitanni. The land around the city of Terka seems still to have been called Hana. But perhaps the dynasty that later ruled Mitanni had its roots in the region around Terka. We'll have to wait to see, hoping that more documents emerge to help us understand. Still, it's clear that by 1500 BCE, the kings of Mitanni and their troops were aggressively fighting in both the east and west. Around this time, a Mitannian king caused problems for a minor western king named Idrimi. He ruled from Aleppo around the end of the Dark Age, and he was forced into exile when the city was attacked. We know about Idrimi's life because he had his autobiography carved on his statue. Unfortunately, it doesn't say who attacked his city. While he was in his lonely exile, he consulted omens and oracles so that he could pick just the right moment to return. When the time was right, Idrimi gathered his allies and made treaties with them. They were united in their opposition to the king of Mitanni. Together, they launched a long campaign, but in the end it was unsuccessful. Idrimi ended up as a vassal of the Mitanni king and swore an oath to support him. This was acceptable, he wrote, because his ancestors had been vassals to previous Hurrian kings. Using the standard term for a vassal, he wrote that he was now a son of the king of Mitanni. Idrimi was given control of a small kingdom and was allowed to continue to fight and raid, but now he was fighting for the Mitannian king rather than against him. This story might have been typical of the time of the expansion in Mitanni. Former enemies of the empire were willing to become vassals because they were allowed to raid and loot in the areas where they fought and to get rich. Before this time, the area that Idrimi ruled and raided had been controlled by the Hittites. The Hittites were now in a weak position and had lost quite a bit of land to Mitanni, though they would soon gain strength again, soon enough. But Mitanni had another enemy as well, one that seemed to come out of nowhere. In 1504 BCE, according to records from Egypt, Egyptian troops charged into Mitanni, fighting all the way to the Euphrates. Egyptian forces had never made it this far north before. So by 1500 BCE, there were four major powers in the Near East: the Hittites, Egyptians, Mitannians, and Kassite Babylonians, and three of them had imperialistic aims. Only the Kassites seem to have been uninterested in expanding their kingdom. Worse yet, the Hittites, Mitannians, and Egyptians all wanted to control the same coastal area of western Syria. They all had strong armies and powerful kings. So where was Hana in all of this? We don't know yet. It might have been a vassal state of Mitanni, or perhaps a vassal of Babylon. Or maybe it was hanging on as an independent power. Hana had survived through the Dark Age, but it never again seems to have played an important role in international affairs. I hope that at some point more documents from Hana will be found and will help clarify this fascinating and puzzling era. Around 1500 BCE, towards the beginning of what's known as the Late Bronze Age, the major Near Eastern powers were at war with one another. Hatti, the land of the Hittites, had expanded south to the Syrian coast. Mitanni had expanded east to fight for control over that same region. And the Egyptians had begun to take over the Levant and to raid lands ruled by Mitanni. The armies of all these great powers were fighting for control of the same area on the Mediterranean coast. The Egyptian kings claimed, in their royal inscriptions, that after they had raided Mitanni, several ambassadors from different lands showed up in Egypt, with gifts for the king, something that had never happened before. These ambassadors came from Hatti, Assyria, Babylonia, among other places. The pharaohs described the gifts they brought as if they were tribute, as though the foreign lands were bowing to the greater power of Egypt. But actually, something quite different was happening. These kingdoms had, for a long time, enjoyed diplomatic relationships with one another, even during times of war. And now they were trying to tame the new imperial power, Egypt. They didn't want Egypt to raid and conquer into their own territories, but they could see that Egypt was rich and powerful. So how could they bring Egypt under control? By treating its king as a diplomatic equal, and sending ambassadors with letters and gifts, just as they did to one another. Eventually, even the king of Mitanni did the same, sending ambassadors to Egypt. Amazingly, it worked. By about 1420 BCE, Egyptian raids to the north had stopped, and peace treaties seem to have been negotiated on all sides. First, the pharaoh probably agreed to peace with Mitanni, then with Hatti, and then with Babylonia. These four, centered in what are now Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, were all the great powers of the time, pretty much equal in military and economic power, but for now, incapable of conquering one another. The really remarkable thing about Egypt's agreement to join the international community is that the Egyptian kings were willing to adopt the Syro-Mesopotamian diplomatic system as a whole, just as it already existed. They didn't demand to be viewed as greater than the other kings, even though Egypt was arguably the richest of the great powers. The pharaohs were even willing to be called brothers of the other great kings. They didn't insist on writing to their allies in Egyptian hieroglyphs. Instead, they had their scribes trained in cuneiform, and they wrote in the Akkadian language of Mesopotamia. They probably agreed to traditional peace treaties in which the obligations were just the same on both sides. It's as though the only way this diplomatic system could be imagined was just the way it had developed many centuries before in Syria. Kings sent ambassadors to one another's courts with letters and gifts. They agreed to abide by peace treaties watched over by the gods of both lands. They called one another brother. They married one another's daughters. And they wrote in cuneiform on clay tablets. The system was a package. If the Egyptian king wanted to join, he couldn't change it. But the pharaohs did resist just one detail of the diplomatic system. Yes, they would accept foreign princesses as wives, but they would never send any of their daughters away from Egypt to marry another king. Never. Amenhotep III put it this way: "From of old, a daughter of the king of Egypt has never been given to anyone." This was a minor detail, and the other kings seem to have grudgingly accepted it. The norm was for great kings of equal power to be willing to either marry a foreign princess or to send a daughter to marry a foreign king. But the slightly more prestigious role was to give a daughter away. A greater king would send his daughter to marry a lesser king, but would never agree to marry the daughter of a lesser king. If a Near Eastern king married the daughter of a vassal, it would send the wrong message. That vassal would become the greater king's father-in-law, which reversed their hierarchical positions. The Egyptian kings didn't see things this way. To their minds, it was much more prestigious to have many foreign wives of any status. So, all the great kings of Egypt, Hatti, Babylonia, and Mitanni were willing to accept this accommodation. If the Egyptian king insisted on only receiving wives and not sending his daughters to the other courts, well, all the kings felt that they had somehow won. The era from 1420 to 1200 BCE is remarkable for the long periods of time when the great powers were at peace with one another as a result of the diplomatic relationships and the marriages between them. It's not that there weren't any battles or wars. There were some, but fewer than in most other eras. The great kings seem to have thrived in this atmosphere. They enjoyed peace and diplomatic relations with their allies, and they sent envoys and letters to one another regularly. We know about all this because we can read and analyze letters written by the kings themselves. Many letters from the rulers of the great kingdoms of Mitanni, Babylonia, Hatti, and Egypt was saved in the archives of Pharaoh Akhenaten in his capital city at Amarna in Egypt. This era is often called the Amarna period. These cuneiform documents were rediscovered in the late 19th century, and they caused quite a stir. No one had anticipated finding a collection of hundreds of cuneiform tablets in Egypt. Because they'd been written on clay tablets, they'd survived just fine. There may have been papyrus records in the same archive, but those have disintegrated. Letters are so different from royal inscriptions, which are usually our main avenue into understanding the politics of any Mesopotamian era. In royal inscriptions, kings put the best possible spin on their actions. and they tended to credit the gods with everything. In letters, the great kings weren't trying to impress the gods or the public. They were negotiating real issues with someone they viewed as an equal, another king. And they were often trying to get something out of their ally. Now, of course, this means that they may not have been entirely honest in the letters, but we can get much more of a sense of their personalities and their motivations. You have a feeling that there was a real complex individual behind the words on the tablet. The great kings' letters to one another were full of gripes and insinuations, but, at least in the early years of this era, they never threatened military action. Their main concerns were the value of the gifts they sent and received, the treatment of their messengers, and the details of the marriages they arranged between their families. The peace and international cooperation of this era always strike me as amazing. This was followed by a time that was very different, when one great empire after another conquered and ruled the entire Near East, starting with the Neo-Assyrian kings. But the kings who ruled from the 15th to the 13th century BCE mostly didn't want to conquer the other great kingdoms. Some of them never led a military campaign at all. Peaceful relationships suited them. Let's look at the life and times of one of these kings, Tushratta, who played a big role internationally. He was a king of Mitanni in the mid-14th century BCE. Unfortunately, we don't have any of his royal inscriptions. His capital city hasn't been excavated, so there are no archives from his reign. But he wrote letters to two kings of Egypt. They're among the Amarna letters, so that's how we know about him. So what did the Amarna letters tell us about him? One letter from Tushratta to the pharaoh showed that he'd had a tough childhood. His father had been king of Mitanni for some time, and after his father died, Tushratta's brother became king. But this brother was soon murdered, and the assassin took control of the country. He didn't try to make himself king. Instead, he placed young Tushratta on the throne as his puppet. The assassin became the regent, so he made the rules, and Tushratta seems to have had no choice but to obey. One of the demands was that Tushratta had to cut off connections with his allies, including the king of Egypt. The Egyptian king was married to Tushratta's sister, along with many other women. So he might well have been alarmed when diplomatic letters stopped coming from Mitanni. Eventually, Tushratta grew up and was able to get his revenge on his brother's assassin. He put it this way: "I was not remiss about the unseemly things that had been done in my land, and I slew the slayers of my brother and everyone belonging to them." After killing his enemy, he had to deal with an attack by the Hittites. As I said, although this was a comparatively peaceful time, there were still battles. The relationship between Mitanni and the Hittites seems to have always been rather strained. Anyway, Tushratta and his army were victorious, and the Hittites retreated. That was when he decided to re-establish his alliances with the other great powers, his father's former allies. We know he reached out to Amenhotep III in Egypt, because his letter survived in Amarna, and he may well have written to the king of Babylon as well. His first letter to Pharaoh Amenhotep III didn't ask for much, just a renewal of diplomatic ties, and he asked the pharaoh to send his messengers back promptly. Soon after that first contact, though, the two kings started negotiations for a royal marriage. One of the Amarna letters is now in the Vorderasiatischer Museum in Berlin, and it contains a letter from Tushratta to Amenhotep III written around this time. It's a fascinating document that reveals a great deal about the international situation of the time, and also about the ways that ambassadors made the whole system work. Tushratta had a daughter named Taduhepa, who was engaged to marry King Amenhotep III. The couple had never met, the princess had never even visited Egypt, and the pharaoh had never visited Mitanni. The whole engagement had been arranged by letter, with a lot of help from the Egyptian ambassador. This was how it happened. Some time before, the pharaoh had sent a letter asking the Mitannian king if he could marry one of the Mitannian princesses, and King Tushratta had been delighted. He'd agreed at once. What could be better than to be related by marriage to his ally, the king of Egypt? Better still, this would make him the pharaoh's father-in-law, which was surely a lofty position. He was actually already the pharaoh's brother-in-law. His sister had married the Egyptian king many years before. But this new wedding would cement their ties. Now, the Mitannian king was almost, but not quite, ready to send the princess to Egypt. A high-ranking Egyptian ambassador named Mane had arrived from Egypt to pick her up. King Tushratta composed a letter to send back to the pharaoh in order to try to buy himself a little more time. This is the letter that's preserved in Berlin. We had, as they say, good news and bad news. He began the letter with some of the good news. The Egyptian ambassador Mane, who had traveled back and forth between Egypt and Mitanni before, had arrived safely in the capital city of Mitanni. Hearing this must have been a relief to the pharaoh when he got the news. The journey from the Egyptian capital of Thebes to the Mitannian capital was about 1,800 miles long, took about 3 months to get there, and it wasn't necessarily a safe journey. There were letters about envoys and merchants being robbed and even killed en route. We know this from this letter that Ambassador Mane traveled with troops, armed guards to protect both the ambassador himself and the expensive gifts that he was transporting. When the pharaoh had sent Mane off to Mitanni, he knew he wouldn't see him for at least 6 months. 3 months to travel in each direction, even if nothing went wrong. But in reality, a diplomatic mission always took longer, because no one arrived and just turned right around and went back. Mane had arrived at the Mitannian court with a letter from the pharaoh. The Mitannian king Tushratta wrote in his reply that, "I read over and over the tablet which he brought, and I heard its words, and they were very sweet. The words of my brother were as if I saw my brother himself. And I rejoiced on that day very much, and I made that day and night a celebration." The arrival of an envoy from a foreign court was almost always the cause of great celebration, whether the man was a Mitannian envoy returning home or a foreign envoy like Mane. Often the celebrations were for 2 envoys arriving at once, one returning home to Mitanni and one from the land he'd visited, because they tended to travel in pairs representing both courts. They'd made it, a banquet was called for. King Tushratta gave the pharaoh some more good news. Amenhotep III had included some instructions in his letter, and the Mitannian king promised to carry out every word of my brother that Mane brought to me. He continued, "In this very year, now, I will hand over my brother's wife, the mistress of Egypt, and they will bring her to my brother." He called his daughter the mistress of Egypt already, even though she hadn't left home yet. But it would be this very year. She'd be coming soon. On that day, he said, will Mitanni and Egypt be as one. A princess who moved away to marry a foreign king had important roles to play. We know from previous eras, and from some later evidence, that she represented her father in her husband's court. She sometimes wrote letters to her father with information about his ally. She symbolized the uniting of the 2 lands, and she might even be the mother of the next king in that land. Some scholars have suggested the princesses were just very expensive luxuries acquired in the gift exchanges between the kings. But this was not the case. The women might not have had control over where they were sent or who they married, but they weren't possessions either. That said, though, the Egyptian king Amenhotep III had a lot of wives. Not only was he already married to the sister of the Mitannian king, he also had married daughters of a number of his vassals and allies. His court must have felt something like the United Nations today, with many different languages being spoken. And the pharaoh wasn't particularly good at keeping track of his wives. He wrote one very defensive letter to the king of Babylon, who wanted to know if his sister had died. She was married to Amenhotep III. Surely he must know whether or not she was alive. Amenhotep III blustered about in this letter, blaming the Babylonian king for not sending an ambassador who actually knew the Babylonian princess and could recognize her. The pharaoh had presented the Babylonian envoys with his wives and left it up to them to figure out which one the Babylonian princess might be. The Babylonian king wondered in his letter if his envoys had been shown some other foreign princess. He thought that the pharaoh had tried to fool his ambassadors, but in the end it seems that no one was really sure what had happened to the Babylonian princess. In some of the other royal courts, the foreign princesses who married the king were very highly regarded and powerful. In the mind of the Mitannian king, the marriage of his daughter to Amenhotep III would symbolize that their two countries had joined together into a single family again. So now King Tushratta had to share some bad news in the letter. Not everything was ready for the princess's departure. It would be another 6 months before he was ready to send her, because he said of all the work he still had to do on her dowry and on the gifts for the pharaoh. And this meant that, well, he just had to detain Ambassador Mane. As the Mitannian king put it, because of this, Mane will be delayed for a bit. I'm sure he could imagine the pharaoh's disappointment, or possibly his anger. Not only had the young bride not been sent yet, but Amenhotep III's own high official would be gone for another 6 months as well. But this wait before the princess could leave was unavoidable. The Mitannian king tried to soften the blow. He switched the topic in his letter to talk about his daughter. She wasn't a child anymore. She has become very matured, he said, and the pharaoh will desire her. She is formed according to my brother's desire. Plus, he would be sending all those gifts. The greeting gift that I am giving, my brother will see as being greater than can be reckoned. But King Tushratta wasn't done with the bad news. This letter is fairly typical of diplomatic correspondence of this era, tipping back and forth between reasons for celebration, excuses for not fulfilling requests, boasts, and complaints. The king's letters were full of assurance of love for his brother king in Egypt, that the host always did one thing that was really bothering him, and almost always it had to do with gifts. We've seen this before. Diplomacy in the ancient Near East always included giving and receiving elaborate gifts. It wasn't bad form for a king to specifically request certain gifts. It was bad form, though, to send something that wasn't valuable enough. All the kings made it look as though the gifts they received were freely given by their foreign allies with no strings attached. But in reality, they were always expected to provide something of equal value in exchange. Egypt was a wonderful partner for the great powers to have, because they all wanted gold all the time, and Egypt had tons of it. The Babylonian king had horses and lapis lazuli. The Mitannian king had glass and textiles. The Hittite king had silver. And they all produced jewelry, clothing, furniture, sculpture, and so on in their own distinctive styles. To own these exotic goods and display them, that was a sure sign of one's power. Any rich person in Egypt could own Egyptian linen and faience. How many Egyptians could decorate their rooms with Babylonian tapestries or Hittite silver drinking vessels? In the same way, a big display of Egyptian gold was a clear demonstration of a king's importance. Each time an ambassador arrived, and especially when a royal wedding was in the works, the king anticipated receiving the goods he'd asked for, and perhaps more besides. King Tushratta described the scene. He had gathered together a big group of dignitaries, including all the foreign guests who were there at his court, presumably at the welcome celebration for Ambassador Mane. The usual protocol on such occasions was for the king to display all the magnificent gifts that the Egyptian envoy had brought with him, showing off his new wealth and luxury goods. This time, the sealed packages containing the gifts were to be cut open right there in front of everyone. King Tushratta had asked the pharaoh for a great deal of gold when he last sent a messenger to Egypt, and he obviously anticipated the awe that the gold would inspire in his guests. But when the packages were cut open, there was something wrong with the gold. The guests looked at the supposedly lavish gifts and said, somewhat snidely, "Are all of these truly of gold?" The king of Mitanni, in his letter, didn't say whether he agreed or disagreed with this assessment. He just kept quoting his powerful guests. They said, "In the land of Egypt, gold is more plentiful than dirt. He, the Egyptian king, loves you very much. But if there be someone whom he loves, then he would not give such things to him." This was the language that the kings used to refer to their relationships. Kings loved one another if they were allies bound by peace treaties. But the foreign guests quoted here were implying that the alliance between Mitanni and Egypt might have been on rockier ground than the Mitannian king had thought. By quoting his guests here, King Tushratta didn't have to say that he believed this. After all, to do so would imply that his own country was in some way inferior to Egypt, where so many riches were readily available. But he did repeat to the pharaoh what he had replied to his guests. He said, perhaps somewhat despondently, "I cannot say before you, my brother, the king of Egypt, loves me very much." He and Amenhotep, who by the way had never met one another, were allies and therefore by definition loving brothers, and yet the frustratingly inadequate gifts suggested otherwise. King Tushratta included this embarrassing episode in his letter to the pharaoh for a reason. He really wanted gold, and he wanted the pharaoh to know that whatever had been sent from Egypt was just not enough. Only a big shipment of gold would assuage his fear that the pharaoh didn't love him anymore. This was not a good time for the alliance to be in jeopardy. After all, Princess Tadouheba would be leaving for Egypt in just a few months. He didn't mince his words as he closed his letter. "So, my brother, may he send me much gold that has not been worked." This was crucial. The Mitannian king wanted gold for his own construction projects, and only unworked gold, presumably in bars or ingots, was of any use for that. The pharaoh had been sending gold that had been formed into jewelry or other objects. This was no use for decorating a building. He continued, "And may my brother exceed the allotment of my father." He wanted even more gold than his father had received. "May Teshrub and Armen grant that my brother reveal love of me." Teshrub was Mitanni's main god, and Armen was the great god of Egypt. King Tushratta respectfully was asking that the gods of both lands nudge the pharaoh into sending him more gold. And he concluded that if this happened, it would cause me to be glorified in the presence of my country and in the presence of my foreign guests. So much of this was about appearances. King Tushratta really wanted all those officials and foreign guests to be impressed. Finally, he reminded the pharaoh of the basic rules of diplomacy. He wrote, "May I fulfill my brother's heart's desire forever, and may my brother fulfill my own heart's desire." He was saying, you tell me what you want and I'll send it. I tell you what I want and you send it. That was what made the whole diplomatic system valuable to all sides. It made them rich and impressive, and it gave them things they could get no other way. This letter was one of many diplomatic letters found in Egypt from this period, and it reveals so much about the diplomatic system of the time. The types of letters that passed back and forth between kings, the gifts that were expected to accompany them, the way the kings thought of themselves as brothers and were determined to be treated as equals. The choice of Akkadian as the language of correspondence, even when, as in the case of Mitanni and Egypt, it wasn't a native language of either king. The sparring over gifts and perceived slights, and the princess who, like so many other princesses, made the one-way journey to live in the land of her father's ally as his wife. And, rest assured, the story of the royal marriage ends happily. When Princess Tadouheba finally left for Egypt, the amount of wealth that changed hands would have been truly staggering. Tablets survive that list the dowry of Princess Tadouheba. It included almost 1,500 items. This included 42 pounds of gold in various forms, along with jewelry, combs, furniture, blankets, and clothing. As gifts for the pharaoh, Separate from the dowry, King Tushratta listed vast amounts of luxury goods, such as horses, gold-plated chariots, horse trappings encrusted with valuable stones and metals, thousands of arrows, javelins, spears, suits of armor, and over 100 textiles. Mitanni was famous for its woolen textiles, so these must have been spectacular objects. A royal marriage provided an opportunity for extravagant generosity, and it was all made possible by the diplomatic skill of the envoys and the regular exchange of letters between the kings. There's no surviving list of what Amenhotep III sent in return to Mitanni. We do, though, have a list of what his son later sent to the king of Babylon for another wedding. There were more than 3,300 objects, including 1,200 pounds of gold. The kingdom of Mitanni, controlling most of what is now northern Iraq and Syria, was at its height from around 1450 to 1350 BCE. At some point during this time, a Mitannian king wrote a letter to one of his vassals in the eastern part of the empire, which concerned a queen named Amaniah. He began the letter like this: "To Ithiya speak, so says the king. With regard to the district of Paharashe, which I previously gave to Queen Amaniah, now from its confines I have assigned a town to Ugi." There's a lot here, even in the first few lines. The first thing is that the king didn't waste time with any niceties. If he'd been writing to someone who was a great king like himself, he'd have begun the letter with a long formal inquiry into his ally's health and the health of his family and the welfare of his army and his country. And he'd have assured his brother king that he himself and his family, his army and his country were all well. But this letter was to a vassal, an inferior, so he could get right to the point. He didn't even give his own name, he was just the king. The second thing you might notice is that he had given a district known as Paharashe to someone, and he was now reassigning a town within that district to someone else. This practice of giving land to high officials is something that was common in this period. The great king could take the land away as easily as he had given it. And it wasn't just a field or two that he'd given, it was a whole region. We'll come back to this in a moment. A third point of interest is that the land had been given to a woman from the local royal family, Amaniah. As it happens, the letter was found in her house, so we know quite a bit about her. We'll come back to her as well. In the letter, the king goes on to say that he'd instructed an official to determine the new boundaries of the land held by Queen Amaniah and of the land given to the man named Ugi. And he wrote, "Ugi shall not encroach upon the territory of Amaniah, and Amaniah shall not encroach upon the boundary of Ugi. Indeed, no one shall encroach upon the boundary of Amaniah." So although he was taking land away from the queen, it was a very specific amount of land with defined borders, and the remaining property continued to be hers. The letter ends with a notice of how Amaniah would be compensated for the loss of her land to the man named Ugi. The king wrote that he had told another local official, "Your own town I have assigned to the district of Amaniah." So, she would still have control of the same number of towns. The king was just switching one for another. The letter was sealed with the cylinder seal of Seushtatar, king of Mitanni. So you might think that the letter was sent by King Seushtatar. This is what the first translator of the letter believed, with good reason. Unfortunately, though, we now know that several later kings, who were descendants of Seushtatar, impressed their ancestors' seal on their own documents, so this letter could actually be from any of them. Seushtatar seems to have been seen as the founder of the empire, so his seal became the dynastic seal for his successors. That means we don't know which king sent the letter, but the seal assures us that it was definitely one of the great kings of Mitanni. So, let's look at Queen Amaniah. The local king who received this letter must have given it to her for her records, since it pertained to lands that she controlled. Amaniah lived in a kingdom called Arapa, in the eastern part of the Mitanni kingdom. Its capital city lies under the modern city of Kirkuk, so it hasn't been and it can't be excavated. Arapa was closer to Ashur than to the heart of Mitanni. Later, it would be part of the kingdom of Assyria. But during this period, the late 15th and early 14th century BCE, Assyria was subject to the Mitannian Empire. King Seushtatar had probably been responsible for conquering the region. A later inscription records that he stole a door of silver and gold from the land of Assyria and took it back to his palace. Queen Amaniah apparently didn't live in the capital city of Arapa, at least not all the time. She had a house in the small nearby town of Nuzi, which was home to about 1,600 people. Archaeologists excavated Nuzi from 1925 to 1931, and they uncovered about 5,000 cuneiform tablets. These have provided us with wonderful details about this era. Amaniah's home was impressive. It was a villa extending over 1,200 square meters, or almost 13,000 square feet, with 35 rooms. Beautifully decorated, it had tile floors and fashionable wall paintings that showed the influence of Egyptian and Aegean art. Amaniah lived there with her son, Crown Prince Shulwateshub, and his family. Shulwateshub was in line for the throne of Arapa. In time, he would become the vassal of the Mitannian king. When the house was excavated, archaeologists uncovered about 730 cuneiform tablets there, recording the business affairs of Prince Shulwateshub, his 8 wives, and his mother. Amaniah's archives show that the land she received from the Mitannian king was just one of 6 large estates that she owned. Quite a few of the tablets listed rations provided by Prince Shulwateshub to every member of his household, including his mother, his wives, and the dozens of servants, hired men, and slaves who helped run the estate. It's surprising in a way that Amaniah would need to be provided with food and clothing from her son's household budget, since she was such a powerful landowner herself. But she was given much more than she needed for her own maintenance. Perhaps she used these goods to provide for her own servants. Meanwhile, the family archive shows that her son made loans to people in the town. As one of the richest men there, he had grain, silver, and wood to spare, and his loans were provided free of interest to people in need. This sounds generous, but we can see from his records that he still foreclosed on people who couldn't pay him back. The situation in the kingdom of Arapa was somewhat typical of the Mitannian Empire. It was a relatively peaceful era, so there are few records in Nuzi of any military activity. The Mitannian king had many vassals who paid him tribute, like the king of Araka. The vassals in turn taxed their subjects in order to provide for their own needs and to come up with the wealth for their tribute payments. But aside from demanding tribute and giving land to important people, the king of Mitanni seems mostly to have left Arapa alone. Besides the letter about Amaniah's land, almost no records from Nuzi mention the great king at all. The people there were preoccupied with local matters. And Arapa was a wealthy kingdom. Even the mayor of Nuzi had an opulent palace with more than 100 rooms. His toilets had marble seats, and some of the private rooms had marble floors. Archaeologists have noticed that there was significant divide between rich and poor in Nuzi, and in some of the other vassal kingdoms of Mitanni. Vast houses like the one owned by Shulwateshub shared neighborhoods with the much smaller dwellings of the poor. But not all of Mitanni's small kingdoms were like this. Some cities were not dominated by palaces, and in those cities there was less of a divide between rich and poor. The houses are much more similar to one another in size. Several sites near the Euphrates in Syria are like this. One of the best known of these is called Amar. In towns like Amar, a group of local men called the Elders played a big role in running things and overseeing legal issues that arose. Local kings existed, but they weren't very powerful. Let's go back to that land that the Mitannian king had given to Ammoniah. We have records of a lot of royal land grants in this era, and not just in Mitanni. Back in the Old Babylonian period, between about 1900 and 1595 BCE, kings had provided some of their officials and soldiers with fields so that they could support their families. But during the following era, the Late Bronze Age, royal gifts of land to officials got very much bigger, including whole towns and the lands around them. Most of these land holdings were much larger than any one household would need. The stage between these two extremes can be seen in some of the documents from the Kingdom of Hana in eastern Syria. In the period between about 1600 and 1450 BCE, before the time of Ammoniah's archive, quite a few contracts have been found in Hana that record royal grants of land. Some of these are for many fields, but some are just for a small property, a single house in one case. There were a number of clauses to these land grant contracts. They started with the description of the land itself, its size, where it was located, and who owned the lands around it. It's interesting to note that the land around the fields being given by the king is often described as belonging to the palace. So the kings seem to have been claiming control of more and more of the land in the kingdom. It was probably less possible than before for private individuals to buy and sell property. The next clause noted who owned the land. In a private sale, this is where you would find the name of the seller. But in the land grants, the current owner was the king. But he wasn't the sole owner. The scribe listed the king and a number of local gods as the owners. It seems that the land wasn't just perceived as royal, but as shared with the gods. Then there was an oath sworn in the names of these same gods. Strangely enough, this was followed by a threat of punishment on anyone who broke the contract. These types of punishments were almost always found on contracts for the sale of land in the Hana kingdom. If someone went back on their word, hot asphalt would be smeared on their head. This protected the buyer from the seller denying the legality of their transaction. But who would go back on a land grant? The person receiving the land, presumably, would have had no reason to contest it. And if the king changed his mind, would officials smear hot asphalt on his head? Certainly not. So the clause probably referred to some previous owner who might claim that the land was actually his. The list of witnesses came next, and these were almost all high officials, often with the king's son as the first witness. One final detail is that the Hana kings always sealed the land grant contracts with their elaborate royal cylinder seals. That means the kings probably were physically there when the contract was drawn up. So the awarding of these land grants might have been accompanied by some sort of ceremony with some of the most important people in the kingdom present, including the king. Starting around 1500 BCE, kings from several other kingdoms adopted the same idea of granting extensive lands to important civil servants and religious leaders. We find grants like this in Hatti and Mitanni and in Babylonia as well. So, for example, there's a tablet from the reign of Saushtatar that records a gift of land in a place called Basiru, and there are several later Mitannian and Hittite tablets of the same kind. Like the earlier Hana kingdom texts, they almost all bear the king's seal. Sometimes it was the great king who was awarding the land. Sometimes it was a local vassal king. The original gift from the Mitannian king to Queen Ammoniah probably was recorded in a contract like this, impressed with the king's seal. We don't have that one. Well, the change in the borders of the lands that she was given came in the form of a letter, and again it was sealed. In Kassite Babylonia, a similar phenomenon was taking place, but most of the records are found not on clay tablets, but on stone steles. These were set up in temples, recording land gifts from the king. They're known as kudurus, and they were an innovation of this era in Babylonia. Like the land grants from Hana, Hatti, and Mitanni, they include a description of the land gift and they note that it's from the king, and they give the name of the man who received it. As with the gift to Amaniah, each recipient received a huge amount of land, probably a whole village with its surrounding fields. The Kudurus don't list the witnesses or the date, but they add a new feature, a curse on anyone who would change the agreement. The obvious person who might go back on his word was the king, but the king couldn't be held to account by any mortal person. The Kudurus seem to have been set out by the recipients, who were often priests, and who were appealing to the gods to hold the king accountable if he took back the land but he provided to them. Some scholars have described this widespread institution of royal land grants as something like a feudal system. The king gave out large estates to his officials and expected their loyalty in return. The officials benefited from the income from the land, but they also were expected to take responsibility for collecting taxes on their estates. But European feudalism was different from this in many ways. The contracts and Kudurus recording late Bronze Age land grants don't usually list what was required of the recipients, and the military side of later medieval feudalism doesn't seem to be present at all. But the system seems to have been an effective way of maintaining control of the lands under Mitannian, Babylonian, and Hittite control. I mentioned that in the town of Nuzi, we'd hardly guess that the Mitannian kings ruled the area. Their names are so rarely found on the tablets. But in some other regions at this time, the kings seem to have been surprisingly active in a number of aspects of their subjects' lives. In the western part of Mitanni and in Hatti, a whole bunch of different types of transactions are described as having taken place in the presence of the king, and many of them had his seal impressed on the tablet. Now, some of the events at which the king was present were as important as the awarding of land grants. Things like the creation of important treaties or legal decisions by the king. You can absolutely understand why the king would have been present for these and why he would have impressed his seal on the documents that were produced. But some of the things that happened in the presence of the king were just common everyday transactions. Someone bought a bull. Someone else bought a slave. A slave was freed by his owner. A woman gave a vineyard and some olives to another woman. All of these took place in the presence of the king. Why did the king need to be there for these everyday occurrences? There's a whole category of tablets that were impressed with the king's seal, and it seems to have been the same seal. So, for example, impressions of the seal of Saoshtatar have been found not only on Amaniah's letter from Nuzi in the far east of the empire, but also on tablets from Tel Brak in the center of the empire, and on others from the sites of Tel Bazi and Omel Mara in the northwest. These sites were hundreds of miles apart. So, why was this true? Why and how did the king's seal get to be on so many different types of tablets in so many distant places? Were the kings of Mitanni in the habit of traveling all around their kingdom, hearing legal cases, and being present for purchases that people made? Or did men and women come to the capital city, get an appointment to be in the presence of the king for the writing of their contracts, and then take the sealed tablets home with them? It could be that both of these things happened. As for why, it may have had something to do with the king's visibility. Today, we don't need to get physically close to our political leaders in order to feel that they have a lot of power over our lives. We see them and we hear about pretty much every detail of what they do. If we can't avoid them, even if we try. They're all over the internet, in every newspaper and magazine, on TV, in talk shows, and on cable news 24/7. But in the world before mass media, the king wasn't omnipresent at all. The Hellenistic Greeks and the Romans used coins with images of the ruler's face on them as propaganda. Coins were useful reminders of who was in charge because absolutely everybody used them to pay for things. Eventually, the leaders even put a second image on the back to commemorate some great victory or achievement. But for our late Bronze Age kings, coins were a long way off in the future. People still weighed out silver on a scale when they paid for things. So, how did the king keep his name in people's minds? How did he remind his people of who he was and what he'd done? If particular legal contracts needed the king's presence, well, that reminded you about him, and maybe even got you into the same room with him. But could the king really have been there so often, so many minor legal procedures? It would have been very time-consuming. Kings had their kingdoms to run. Perhaps the actual king didn't need to be present at all for some of these transactions. Maybe an official seal bearer was allowed to roll the king's seal on some of these tablets for him. It could even be that a statue of the king could have served in place of the king himself. There's no certain evidence for this, but since everyone believed that statues had their own life force, and that some part of the king was captured in his statue, this might have been a good solution to the need for the king to be in many places at once. Royal statues certainly stood in for the king in several other situations, like when oaths were sworn in his name, and they reminded the populace of how important he was. In these various ways, the kings of Mitanni seem to have been able to control their realms without necessarily resorting to force. The power of vassals to break away from the king was limited by the fact that the great king directly owned some of the lands within their realms, and he could give those lands to whomever he chose. Queen Amaniah, for example, promptly felt an allegiance to the king of Mitanni because of the lands he'd awarded to her, as well as an allegiance to her husband, the vassal king of Arapra. The increased engagement of the king with intricate details of the lives of his subjects might also have convinced them of his legitimate right to rule over them. After all, like rulers in any period of ancient Near Eastern history, the kings of the Late Bronze Age needed to be sure that soldiers and laborers would appear when they were drafted, and that people would pay their taxes. If the king was someone who lived far away in a capital city you'd never visited, he had to find ways to remind you of his power and of your role as his subject. So if he gave land to someone you knew, or if his seal was needed on a contract you had to draw up, or if he sometimes visited your city to hear legal cases, or if his statue was there in your town needing offerings, then he was a real presence in your life. He was someone for whom you might be willing to work or to fight. The Late Bronze Age seems, as a result, to have been an era of peace and prosperity, not just between the great kings, but also within their kingdoms. Mitanni thrived for more than 150 years, but towards the middle of the 14th century, things started to go downhill. We get a glimpse of this in the correspondence of King Tushratta of Mitanni with the kings of Egypt. Tushratta's daughter, Taduhepa, had married the pharaoh Amenhotep III, and at that time, he'd asked a favor of his Egyptian ally. He wanted a gold statue of Taduhepa. This request for a statue of his daughter had a precedent. When Amenhotep III had married a Babylonian princess, he'd sent a statue of that princess to her father, the king of Babylon. Perhaps the statue could serve as a physical confirmation of the marriage relationship between the two kings. That's what Tushratta implied when he'd first written to Amenhotep about this. He quoted what he thought other people would say about the statue of his daughter once it arrived. He wrote that, "Before earth and before the heavens are the words spoken, this gold image is Taduhepa, the daughter of Tushratta, the lord of Mitanni, whom he gave as wife of Amenhotep, the lord of Egypt. And Amenhotep made a molten gold image and full of love dispatched it to Tushratta." People would, according to him, see the statues as confirming the alliance and love between himself and the pharaoh. Later, Tushratta added to the request. Now he wanted a statue of himself, as well as one of his daughter Taduhepa. This obviously couldn't have been a real likeness, since Tushratta had never traveled to Egypt, and none of the Egyptian artisans would ever have seen him. But that wasn't a concern. Statues weren't intended to look like the person they depicted. They were idealized. Tushratta was also now more specific. He said the statue should be, in his words, of solid cast gold, one of myself, and a second statue, a statue of Taduhepa, my daughter. Solid cast gold. That was quite a request. Amenhotep III wrote back, "Don't talk of giving statues just of solid cast gold. I will give you ones made also of lapis lazuli." Lapis lazuli is a deep blue stone that was greatly prized by the ancient peoples. You can imagine the Tushratta must have been thrilled. We know from royal letters found in the late 19th century in Amarna in Egypt that Amenhotep III had the statues made. Not only that, he made sure that the Mitannian diplomatic corps saw them and could attest to their existence. But the pharaoh didn't get around to sending them before he died. At the time of his death, Amenhotep III had been married to Taduhepa for only 2 years. His son Akhenaten inherited the throne, and some of his father's wives. Akhenaten married Taduhepa, which meant that Tushratta was still the father-in-law of the king of Egypt. King Tushratta hoped that their relationship would be just as close as the bond he'd had with Akhenaten's father. He expressed this repeatedly in his letters. But Akhenaten turned out not to be a reliable ally or correspondent. For Tushratta, the big change in their relationship was all wrapped up with the issue of the gold statues. Akhenaten simply didn't send them. The gift that was eventually transmitted, something less than the Mitannian king had been anticipating. Tushratta described what happened. He said, "My brother," that's Akhenaten, "sent me statues made of wood. They were gold-plated, but they weren't the solid gold statues he'd been promised." He wrote to Egypt over and over after this to complain about how he'd been snubbed. He even wrote to Akhenaten's mother, Tia, asking her to put in a word with her son to convince him to send the gold statues. The failure to send a gift might sound trivial to us, but so much of the alliances between the great kings of this era took the form of reciprocal gift-giving. Tushratta was obsessed with Akhenaten's failure to send the statues, not just because he wanted more gold, but because he clearly felt himself to be slipping out of Egyptian favor. He depended on his alliances, and the physical proof of them was seen in the regular exchange of letters, gifts, and messengers. As far as we know, the gold statues never arrived, and Mitanni's relationship with Egypt never returned to the warm friendship Tushratta had shared with Amenhotep III. Pharaoh Akhenaten was no longer interested in maintaining close ties with Mitanni. Meanwhile, the Hittites were gaining in power and becoming more aggressive, and they had never been friendly with Mitanni, even at the best of times. You can imagine that Tushratta was getting worried, when he was right to. Mitanni's days as a great power were almost over. More than 3,000 years ago, a ship left the island of Cyprus, 20 tons of cargo and royal gifts. It was probably heading for Greece. The wooden boat was 49 feet long and sturdily built. But off the coast, at a place now known as Uluburun in Turkey, the crew faced a crisis, and the ship sank. It stayed there untouched on the seafloor until it was discovered by underwater archaeologists in 1982. Over the next decade, the archaeologists were able to recover many objects from the wreck and to begin to piece together a surprisingly vivid picture of ancient Near Eastern trade. When the ship was first recovered, there was a lot of discussion about which country it might have come from. Was it from Canaan or Greece or Cyprus? The crew's possessions consisted of objects from all over the place, including an Egyptian gold scarab, Mycenaean pots from Greece, and sets of Canaanite weights. On the ship's hold was packed with 10 tons of copper from Cyprus in the form of 354 ingots. Each ingot weighed about 50 pounds. There was no obvious single source for the goods on board. The director of the excavation concluded that the crew was probably mostly from Syria and Canaan. 4 of the passengers appeared to be merchants who'd brought along sets of balance weights so that they could weigh gold and silver payments or bulk goods that they might be buying. Someone, presumably the captain of the ship, had a Canaanite sword. The crew would have used the simple bowls, knives, and Canaanite oil lamps that were found. They fished with fish hooks and net sinkers, and they seem to have had a simple life on board. To pass the time, they kept a set of knuckle bones. The knuckle bones might have worked much like dice in modern games. The boat wasn't just a trading vessel, though. 2 other men on board appeared to have been ambassadors, and some of the goods in the hold might have been luxury gifts for their king in Greece, perhaps received from the king of Alassia in what is now Cyprus. This was during the Mycenaean period in Greece, hundreds of years before the classical era. It was the time that provided the setting for the later legends of the Iliad and the Odyssey. We know from contemporaneous records that the king of Alassia sent vast amounts of copper to the pharaoh in Egypt in exchange for luxury goods. So he probably had similar relationships with other lands, possibly including Mycenaean Greece. Each of the shipwrecked diplomats had a 5-piece set of Mycenaean pouring and drinking vessels. Each one also had a necklace, a Mycenaean sword, and a seal to stamp his goods. Between them, they owned 5 razors to shave with. They were elite, important men. Their swords demonstrate that. And they didn't have weights and measures, so they weren't merchants. The cargo also included 1 ton of tin, which is just the right amount to make 11 tons of bronze when combined with the 10 tons of copper that were also aboard the ship. Bronze was essential to the economy of this period. It was used to make all kinds of tools, weapons, and statues. Regions that didn't have access to copper and tin had no choice but to import it. There were also almost 800 pounds of glass ingots from Egypt and the Near East, along with 24 stone anchors and 150 Canaanite jars, half of which were filled with 1,000 pounds of terebinth resin. Terebinth was used as incense and as part of the mix for making perfumed oil. There were other goods as well: ebony logs and ivory tusks from Africa, and 3 ostrich eggshells, along with spices and olives. So the ship must have picked up some goods in Canaan, things like the terebinth, the tin, the glass ingots, and then it moved on to Cyprus. There, perhaps, the Mycenaean ambassadors joined the crew after having visited the Alashian court, and the boat was loaded with the copper. The vessel was probably on its way to Greece when it sank. We don't know if the crew, the merchants, and the envoys survived. No skeletons were found, and the boat was only 60 yards from shore, so perhaps they did. One great thing about the Uluburun shipwreck is that it's like a time capsule, frozen just the way it was before sinking. We know from letters between kings of this time that vast amounts of gold, copper, and other luxury goods were regularly sent from one court to another, and the shipwreck shows how some of these goods were transported. The Akkadian language of Mesopotamia was the lingua franca of the age, and letters written in Akkadian passed regularly between the courts of the Near Eastern kings. Only a tiny fraction of what was written has survived, and just a couple of shipwrecks have been found. But they hint at a time of just unprecedented international cooperation. The Uluburun shipwreck provides a clue that the Mycenaean Greeks were part of this diplomatic world. We can guess this because of the people on the boat and the gifts they appear to have been bringing. We don't yet have any letters from Mycenaean kings to the great kings of the other lands, but letters might well have existed and just not been found yet. The ship and its passengers were probably taking a circular route around the eastern Mediterranean. After unloading the goods and letting off the ambassadors in Greece, the vessel would have gone on to Crete, then across the Mediterranean to Egypt, and back along the coast eastwards to Canaan. Ships on this route probably also stopped at the city of Ugarit on the North Syrian coast. This was one of the great international ports of the Late Bronze Age. That's the period from around 1600 to 1200 BCE. Ugarit was in the orbit of Egyptian power, but it wasn't a vassal of Egypt. Its people didn't pay tribute. Documents found there are written in almost all the languages of the region: Akkadian, Egyptian, Hurrian, Hittite, Cypro-Minoan, and Ugaritic. So people who lived and worked there came from all over the place. Ugarit was rich from trade and from the manufacture and export of a vivid purple dye made from a shell called murex. The dye was so valuable that purple became the color of royalty for centuries afterward. Ugarit's royal family lived in a palace famous for being one of the most spectacular buildings in the region. The city prospered not only because of its strategic coastal location, but also because the era was peaceful and people could travel easily. So, Ugarit had a diverse population and a thriving economy based on international trade, and little interest in maintaining a military. This whole international system of trade and diplomacy between independent states worked smoothly for centuries. If you wanted glass, you got it from Canaan or Egypt. If you wanted silver, you got it from Anatolia. Copper came from Cyprus, which was ancient Al-Ashia. Horses came from Mitanni in Syria. The best textiles came from Babylonia in what is now Iraq. Olive oil and perfume came from Greece, ivory and ebony from Africa, incense from Arabia, and gold from Egypt. Ships were probably built and manned in many different lands, and their cargoes and crews were international. Merchants, envoys, craftsmen, and guards traveled across the entire region regularly, both on the water and across land in caravans. Ideas and artistic styles spread as well, so that you can find a wall painting in Nuzi, way over in northeastern Mesopotamia, that was influenced by the artistic style that developed on the island of Crete, more than 1,500 miles to the west. Of course, the general economy was still based on agriculture. Each land seems to have produced enough food for its own people, supported by irrigation to water the fields and river valleys, or by rainfall. Even high officials typically owned farmland. They would hire laborers to work the land, while also taking a personal interest in it. Now, one of the first things to go wrong with the international system didn't end up destroying it, but it was a shock. In Anatolia during the 14th century BCE, a Hittite prince named Suppiluliuma swore allegiance to his brother the king, but then he had his brother killed so that he could take the throne. This was a heinous crime, not just the murder, but also the fact that Suppiluliuma had broken an oath to the gods, and this would come back to haunt him later. Suppiluliuma was a contemporary of King Tushratta of Mitanni and of the pharaoh Akhenaten in Egypt, as well as of a king named Burnaburiash I in Babylonia. At first, Suppiluliuma seemed to fit into the Brotherhood of Kings just fine. For instance, he had his ambassadors negotiate a marriage with Babylon, and he married King Burnaburiash's daughter. But soon, it was clear that he had no love for King Tushratta or for Mitanni. Suppiluliuma launched a military campaign that devastated some of Mitanni's cities, though he was unable to capture the capital. The whole campaign upended a lot of the assumptions that populations in small cities and vassal kingdoms had had about their safety. The leaders of the port city of Ugarit decided to side with him rather than to risk invasion. Tushratta of Mitanni died soon after this, killed by one of his sons. A relative then claimed the throne, while another of Tushratta's sons fled to Suppiluliuma for help. The Hittite king agreed and gave him troops to help him seize the throne. But this Mitannian prince was no longer independent after his victory. His land was now subject to Hatti, the land of the Hittites. Cementing the new relationship between Hatti and Mitanni, the prince of Mitanni married Suppiluliuma's daughter. But this wasn't a marriage between equals, like many of the other diplomatic marriages. Mitanni was no longer a major power. Instead, the western half of Mitanni now belonged to Hatti, and the eastern half declared its independence as the Kingdom of Assyria. Then, things began to settle down a little. The new king of Assyria made an alliance with the king of Babylon and, as usual, negotiated a diplomatic marriage. Assyria replaced Mitanni as a great power in the Brotherhood of Kings. As it happens, a really unusual diplomatic marriage almost happened at around this same time. A queen of Egypt wrote to Suppiluliuma, stating that her husband had died and she had no sons to succeed him. She'd heard that Suppiluliuma had many sons. Would he please send one of them to become her husband? We can't be sure of the Egyptian queen's name, but she was probably the widow of Tutankhamun or Akhenaten, and this request was totally unprecedented. She would have viewed anyone outside the royal family as a servant, and that was something of a problem, because, as she explained, she didn't want to marry a servant. Although there were probably plenty of high officials anxious to marry her and become pharaoh, she decided to take matters into her own hands and use the 1,000-year-old institution of diplomatic marriage to find herself a husband. This man was going to be someone who was her equal, a royal prince, not a commoner. The Hittites were allies, and she must have decided that a Hittite prince would do. Suppiluliuma was completely dumbfounded. He was so shocked that he sent an envoy to Egypt to check. Was this for real? Did the Egyptian queen really want to marry a Hittite prince? Would his son really become pharaoh? The Hittite envoy returned several months later with a curt reply from the queen. Of course she was telling the truth. Any Hittite prince that Suppiluliuma sent would become king of Egypt. Fair enough. Suppiluliuma chose his son Zananza, and presumably organized bridal gifts and the wedding party, and they sent them off to Egypt. On the way, though, the worst happened. Zananza was murdered. Now relations between Egypt and Hatti collapsed. Suppiluliuma sent troops into a part of Canaan that Egypt controlled. Earlier in his reign, he'd sworn by the gods to abide by a peace treaty with Egypt. So here was Suppiluliuma breaking another oath. In taking prisoners of war and riches from Canaan, Suppiluliuma got something else as well, something no one wanted. The POWs he captured were infected with plague. The illness spread terribly through Hatti, eventually killing the king himself. To ancient eyes, the reason for this was obvious. Suppiluliuma had broken his oaths to the gods. Of course the gods would kill him. This is what Suppiluliuma's son wrote in a prayer to the gods, in hopes of making the plague go away. He pleaded with them to spare the rest of the people. Too many had died, and eventually the plague did end. Through all of this, tensions stayed high between Egypt and Hatti, until their armies met in battle in 1274 BCE. This was at Kadesh, located on the border between their empires in the western part of Syria. The Egyptian king was now Ramses II, who went on to rule for more than 60 years. In Ramses' account of the battle, he claimed that at one point he fought and was defeating the Hittite army single-handed. The Egyptians were completely victorious. But the Hittites also claimed to have won. Of course, it's impossible for both sides to have conquered one another. We do know that the Hittites kept control of the city of Kadesh, but mostly it was a stalemate. Neither side was going to gain the upper hand. After a while, in 1258 BCE, the two sides agreed to an alliance, and they cemented it, as always, with a peace treaty and a diplomatic marriage. Ramses II married a Hittite princess. From that time on, Egypt and Hatti had a peaceful relationship, right up until both empires came to an end, about a century later. The reason the Late Bronze Age ended has been discussed a great deal, because it was so dramatic. Once things started going wrong, it was like a domino effect. The Late Bronze Age, from around 1600 to 1200 BCE, had been so stable and prosperous. The empires of Hatti and Egypt, the Kassite kingdom of Babylonia, they'd lasted much longer than most previous kingdoms. But soon, it was all gone. the Hittite Empire completely collapsed by 1185 BCE, and the citadel of the capital city burned down. A few years later, in 1155 BCE, the Babylonian kingdom was invaded by the Elamites of modern-day Iran. The kingdom of Assyria, which had expanded when Mitanni was conquered, shrank back to an area around the capital city of Ashur. Egypt's long, stable New Kingdom period came to an end as well by 1070 BCE, after more than 400 years. Besides the big kingdoms, the smaller kingdoms of the Mediterranean also suffered. Actually, they seem to have suffered even more. Several Mycenaean cities of Greece were destroyed, and after the cities along the coast of Syria and Canaan gained independence from Hatti and Egypt, many of them were destroyed as well. What happened? There aren't many clues in the texts. In most places, it seems the documents just stopped being written around this time, with no indication as to why this was the case. But in the Syrian trade port of Ugarit, archaeologists found some letters that seem to have been written right before the city was destroyed by invaders. In one letter, the king of Ugarit, Hammurabi, wrote urgently to the king of another city. He said that there were ships of the enemy visible at sea, and he needed help. It's not immediately clear who these enemies were, and his ally didn't send reinforcements. Instead, the neighboring king wrote back, telling him to surround your town with ramparts, have your troops and chariots enter there, and await the enemy with great determination. This was absolutely no help. Ugarit had never possessed much in the way of a military force, and the troops it did command were away, helping the king of Hatti. Now, those enemy ships arrived in the port and did enormous damage to the rich, unprotected Ugarit. Still, the embattled king, Hammurabi, survived, and was still in Ugarit when a letter arrived from the island of Cyprus, from the king of Al-Ashir, who was asking him for help. Al-Ashir was also being attacked. Hammurabi wrote back that he couldn't be of any assistance at all. He explained that the enemy's ships came here, my cities were burned, thus the country is abandoned to itself. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted great damage upon us. These unidentified enemies seem to have continued south along the coast, destroying and looting as they went. Their destination seems to have been Egypt, the richest of all Mediterranean lands. Unfortunately for us, the Egyptian king recorded the invaders' attack and his response. This was Ramses III, who later claimed to have achieved a glorious victory over the intruders. He covered the walls of his mortuary temple with relief sculptures and descriptions of the events. And here's how he tells the story. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once, the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. From Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Al-Ashir on, being cut off at one time. Their confederation was the Peliset, Cheker, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh, lands united. So, the enemy invaders were from islands. They've come to be known as the Sea Peoples. Relief sculptures in Egypt show some of the invaders arriving in boats, and the scenes of battle have plenty of details. The defending Egyptian boats are all manned and orderly, whereas the foreign boats are distinctly non-Egyptian in shape and are all in disarray, with some of the enemy fighters falling into the sea. The enemies wear distinctive headdresses and kilts. They seem to have been observed and drawn from memory. It does seem as though people were on the move by boat, that Ramses III wasn't making this up. Some of the Sea Peoples are even shown arriving by land in wagons with women, children, and household possessions. They look as though they were coming to stay. It all looks pretty convincing. The Egyptian army and navy were able to repulse the foreigners, and some of them settled just to the north of Egypt on the coast of Canaan. The group known as the Peliset show up in the Bible as the Philistines, and they gave their name to that area of the Levant, Palestine. Where did the Sea Peoples come from? Many archaeologists agree their origin was indeed across the sea. In fact, the architecture and pottery that began to be used at this time in Philistine sites are very much like Mycenaean architecture and pottery. Some of the Sea Peoples were probably Mycenaean Greeks. Others were probably from Cyprus and southern Anatolia. In fact, this might be the context of the Trojan War, which is believed to have happened right around this time, in the 12th century BCE. According to Homer, this was a period when Greeks were fighting in northwestern Anatolia. The Sea Peoples would also have been on the move at this time, attacking coastal cities in the region. The memory of those campaigns might well have been the seed behind the whole epic tale of the Greeks fighting the Trojans. So why were the Sea Peoples on the move? There are a lot of possibilities. Perhaps there was a drought in their homelands, and they were refugees fleeing starvation. There is some evidence for a drought, not just in Greece, but across the northern Mediterranean. Hatti seems to have imported grain from Ugarit and from Egypt around 1200, and the king wrote about a famine when he requested the grain. Previously, they had been able to grow enough food in an area that depended on rainfall to water crops. A few years of drought, therefore, could be devastating. People from the whole region would have suffered, and many could have fled, looking for somewhere to live where food was more plentiful. Another possibility is that a series of earthquakes caused huge fires. There's evidence for earthquake damage and burned buildings at several sites in the region. Again, this would have been devastating to local inhabitants. People might have had to move in order to survive, becoming refugees. Still, scholars think that neither drought nor earthquakes was sufficient to be responsible for the amount of upheaval that marked the end of the great Bronze Age civilizations. Another possible explanation is that the extreme gap between the rich and poor of the time might have resulted in the poor rising up. It's certainly true that the elites in the late Bronze Age lived in great luxury and depended on the poor to provide much of their wealth. The palaces, for example, had something of a monopoly on bronze. Weavers worked for the palaces to make beautiful textiles and were paid in food rations, while the textiles were used as luxury gifts for which the king might receive gold or silver in return. Some people do seem to have resisted the amount of work they were called upon to perform for the palaces and temples. In Canaan, there was a group of outlaws known as the Habiru, who seemed to have abandoned urban life. And in peace treaties of the time, one of the main concerns was always with the extradition of fugitives who left one land and tried to live in another. This wouldn't have been a major negotiating point if it hadn't been an ongoing problem. A significant number of people must have fled their cities and their debts and the demands the state put on them to try to live somewhere else. The destruction of palaces and citadels at some sites might have been the work of unhappy local subjects rather than invaders. There's no confirmation of this, but it would help explain why some cities were destroyed while others had no destruction at all, and why in some cities only the citadel was destroyed while private houses were untouched. Once the seeds of rebellion were sown, or an armed migration of refugees was unleashed, it seems that other things began to break down. It's not that the Sea Peoples showed up everywhere, but instead that similar types of destruction spread across the region. For example, there's no sign that the Sea Peoples made it to Hatti, even though the palaces of the Hittite capital were destroyed. The capital city was far inland, hundreds of miles from the route of the Sea Peoples. So the attackers on the Hittite capital might have come from closer to home, the neighboring Gazga people perhaps. Or this destruction might also have been a result of social unrest among the Hittite population. The Sea Peoples didn't directly cause the reversals in Assyria and Babylonia either. What seems likely is that a whole lot of things got out of balance. Whatever the first trigger was, whether drought, rebellion, earthquakes, or all three, the system began to disintegrate. Things became quite dangerous in some regions. Some people took to the roads in wagons or to the sea in boats to pursue life elsewhere. Raiders looted and burned buildings. People couldn't travel safely to trade or deliver messages or luxury gifts anymore. Great kings lost contact with one another and had no source for the expensive foreign goods they wanted. Ships like the one found at Golobarun no longer could peacefully tie up at ports around the Mediterranean and expect a civil welcome. All around the Mediterranean coast, small states now replaced the big empires. In Greece, for example, people were much poorer than before, with simple grave goods replacing elaborate ones. Overseas trade seems to have stopped. The Mycenaeans had used a writing system that modern scholars call Linear B, but that too was forgotten. All over the place, there were fewer big cities and many more people living in the countryside. And it wasn't a peaceful time. Battles took place regularly between the various small kingdoms. This period, from about 1155 to 972 BCE, is often referred to as a Dark Age, because not much documentation survives to help us understand what was going on. Tablets inscribed with cuneiform texts are rarely found at the archaeological sites from this era. This might be because people were writing on papyrus, which typically doesn't survive for hundreds or thousands of years, but you do get the sense of a very different era from the one that came before. In spite of all the gaps in our knowledge about this era, there is one giant source of information for history in the Levant during this time, and that's the Hebrew Bible. This era was when the kingdom of Israel formed. It was the time of Israel's battles against the Philistines and the Canaanites, and of its first kings. The Bible describes Solomon's relationships with the neighboring land of Tyre and with other kingdoms, like distant Sheba. The leaders exchanged luxury goods, and Solomon married the daughters of neighboring kings. It does look from the Bible as though some aspects of the old diplomatic system was still working. But the long era of peace and international cooperation between major kingdoms, that had come to an end. Once the system started to break down, it was impossible to save it. The old empires were divided up into smaller, squabbling kingdoms. If these kingdoms kept many records, they don't seem to have survived. As a child growing up in England, one of the most exciting things I can remember was going to London for the day. I was terrified of riding the underground trains, but everything else seemed magical. One of my most vivid memories is of visiting the British Museum, and especially the giant winged lion statues at the entrance to the Assyrian galleries. This was long before I decided to spend my career studying ancient Mesopotamia. I was just a schoolgirl, but the majesty of those sculpted lions was almost overwhelming. They were immense, up to 14 feet tall. From the front, each one looked like a bearded man, but his head was set on the body and legs of a giant cat, and he wore a horned crown. From the side, each stone figure appeared to be striding forwards, with wings that spread right across the top of his back, as though he were about to take off in flight. I'd never seen anything so impressive or otherworldly. Later, during graduate school, I went back to visit these giant lion men, and they still took my breath away. The Assyrian kings who created them might never have guessed that they would still stand guard over a doorway thousands of years later. But now they were in a London museum rather than in the Assyrian capital. The Assyrian kings might have been pleased, though, to know that these sculptures still have the power to make us gasp. The empire of the Assyrians was centered on the Tigris River in northern Mesopotamia, and through all the thousands of years of history that separate us from them, their legend lived on. The Sumerians and Akkadians of southern Mesopotamia would be forgotten for thousands of years. They had to be rediscovered in the 19th century. But the Assyrians were immortalized by the Bible and by Greek and Roman authors. They were never forgotten. And so, when archaeologists first started digging in Iraq during the mid-19th century, it was evidence of the Assyrian Empire that they were looking for. They found it, and it was just as impressive as they had imagined. It turns out that Assyria existed long before the time of the Bible. Until the 14th century BCE, it was just one state among many in Mesopotamia. In fact, through much of the 15th and 14th centuries BCE, Assyria was subject to the kingdom of Mitanni, the great power that dominated northern Mesopotamia. But western Mitanni was subsumed into the Hittite Empire around the 1330s BCE, and Assyria regained its independence. For the next 700 years, until the end of the 7th century BCE, Assyria played a huge role in Mesopotamian history. It was led by one of the most stable dynasties anywhere in all of history, with the throne passing from father to son over and over again. Eventually, the Assyrians created an empire on a huge scale, much bigger than anything that had come before, and it set the basic model for how an empire should be run. All later empires in the Near East and the Mediterranean regions, the empires of the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans, they all learned from the Assyrians. Before I start discussing the details of the Assyrian phenomenon, I should be clear about some terms. First is the term Assyria. That's not what the Assyrians called their country. They called it Ashur. Their capital city was also known as Ashur, and the god of the city and the land of Ashur was also named Ashur. The god Ashur wasn't a cosmic god. He wasn't a planet or a star or a force of nature. He was physically present in the city of Ashur as the rock formation on top of which his temple was built, towering above the river. So they had a god, a city, and a country, all with the same name. Imagine today if we had a country called God, with a capital city also called God. You might assume that the people there would be pretty religious, pretty devoted to God, and that does seem to have been true in Ashur. They absolutely believed in the power and the supremacy of their god. It's not that they didn't believe in other gods as well, or that they were monotheists. They still worshipped the whole pantheon of Mesopotamian gods. But in their minds, it was Ashur, not Enlil, who was the most powerful, the king of the gods. In any event, to make things a little less confusing, we now refer to their country as Assyria rather than Ashur. The heartland of Assyria, that is the area that always remained subject to this long dynasty of kings, was mostly located along the Tigris River. Its southern edge lies in the area around the city of Ashur, which remained the religious capital of Assyria even after the political capital was moved further north up the Tigris River, first to the city of Kalhu and ultimately to Nineveh. Nineveh was next to present-day Mosul and north of Ashur by about 60 miles. It marked the northern edge of the heartland. And in the east, closer to the Zagros Mountains, was the city of Arbela, about 60 miles northeast from Ashur and about 50 miles east of Nineveh. If you lived anywhere in this triangle, at any time through the 7th century BCE, you lived in the land of Assyria. The lands beyond the triangle was sometimes under the control of other kingdoms, but there was no obvious boundary to Assyria. It didn't have a coastline, and it wasn't right next to a mountain range. So the Assyrian kings always felt vulnerable to attack. From the 14th century onward, these kings wanted to expand their boundaries, and not only for defensive purposes. Conquering neighboring lands for the god Ashur was seen as a religious thing to do, an act of piety. In spite of Assyria's lack of obvious borders, it had some advantages for the people who lived there. There was enough rainfall for farming, so farms were scattered all across the landscape. Unlike in the south, farms weren't located only by the rivers. And Assyria was at the crossroads of several major roads and trading routes. In fact, the cities of Ashur and Nineveh were both located where it was possible to ford the Tigris, so lots of commerce came through. The era of the Assyrian kingdom that thrived during the late 2nd millennium BCE is known as the Middle Assyrian period. It was at its height from around 1365 to 1076 BCE. This was around 500 years after the end of the Old Assyrian period, when Assyrian merchants traded and set up colonies in what is now Turkey. That period had lasted from around 1974 to 1807 BCE. The Middle Assyrian period is also distinct from the later Neo-Assyrian period, which lasted from around 911 to 610 BCE, when the Assyrians built a truly vast empire. The Middle Assyrian kings managed to expand their kingdom all the way to the Euphrates River in the west. These kings tend to get overshadowed by their more famous descendants who built the Neo-Assyrian Empire. But in a way, the Middle Assyrian kings were the ones who created the mold for later rulers to follow. The Middle Assyrian army had a large infantry and a smaller force of chariots, but the soldiers weren't available year-round. Most of them were Assyrian farmers who were free to fight only about 3 months a year. This was during the summer between harvest and the sowing season. That changed in later centuries, when kings eventually created a standing army. But the army's organization stayed much the same over time, with divisions of 10, 50, and 100 men. Middle Assyrian military leaders also came up with the idea of deporting conquered peoples from one part of the empire to another. Although this was probably incredibly unpopular with the people being deported, it wasn't a death march. It wasn't really even designed as a punishment. The deportees were given shoes and provisions, and when they arrived at their destinations, they were also given land. The point was not to kill them, they were supposed to survive. Deportation was a way to settle people in underpopulated parts of the empire that could be opened up for farming. It was also a benefit in the king's minds to integrate the population so that the newly conquered peoples might begin to think of themselves as Assyrian. And of course, these peoples were less likely to rebel if they were busy making new lives for themselves far away from their original homelands. The Middle Assyrian kings, along with all their successors right to the end of the 7th century BCE, were considered to be high priests of the god Ashur. In most Mesopotamian lands, the priests and kings played distinct roles, but Assyrian kings were both. If an important festival came up, when a king was away on campaign, he had to return to perform in it. The kings were proud of the many temples they constructed for the gods in cities all over their empire. A lot of the royal inscriptions that survive are about these temples. So the Middle Assyrian kings were war leaders, priests, and builders of cities and temples. But in spite of their tendency towards self-promotion, the Assyrian kings didn't name the years of their reigns after their glorious successes, as southern Mesopotamian kings had done for centuries. Instead, each year was named for an official, called a limu, who was chosen by lot from the heads of powerful families, and who played a role in the annual New Year's festival. The man who held the post of limu during the year had the whole year named after him. You can imagine that these limu year names might have been hard to remember. Suppose you were born in the year called Enam Ashur, son of Begaya. How old would you be in the year Shuli, son of Uphakum? In our dating system, the year Enam Ashur probably corresponds to 1954 BCE, and the year Shuli was 1941 BCE, but at that time they had no numbers for their years. Luckily, they did keep lists of limu names. This would let you figure out, in our example, that you were 13 years old in the year Shuli, son of Uphakum. Later scribes seem to have used these lists of limus from each reign to create a larger list of all the Assyrian kings and the lengths of their reigns. This documentation is useful for historians in reconstructing events and in understanding chronology. Chronology is a fascinating field of ancient history because it's a giant puzzle. Historians still aren't at all sure that we have the right dates for events before the first millennium BCE. Whenever I mention a date of an event or a king's reign, it means that modern scholars have reconstructed that date from several different types of evidence, and other scholars have certainly argued about it, and it may well still be wrong. Translating a limu date to a year BCE isn't a simple process. For example, 1400 BCE was 1400 years before Jesus was born. But of course, the people living at that time had no idea that they were in 1400 BC or BCE because C hadn't been born yet. I did actually see on a message board once that a man claimed that the oldest coin he owned was 2200 years old. He said it was stamped 225 BC. I hope he didn't pay much for it. Anyways, these Assyrian lists of Limu names and lists of kings have helped historians count backwards from known dates so that they can assign BCE dates to historical events. From the 12th century BCE onwards, we can be pretty sure that the dates we use are correct for the main Mesopotamian kingdoms. Before that, there's a lot more uncertainty. Scholars have to look at things like ancient records of eclipses and of planets in the night sky. They look at tree rings and volcanic eruptions that left layers of ash in ice cores recovered from the Arctic Circle. And then they try to correlate those with kings and ancient events. It's a fascinating mystery. The longer ago the event, the more wrong the date we've come up with is likely to be. Some really early Limu lists that have recently been found have been a huge help. It seems now that for events in the 2nd millennium BCE, we're probably within a decade or so of being correct about most of the dates. So let's go back to the end of the Middle Assyrian period. Between 1200 and 1100 BCE, the kingdom of Hatti collapsed, Egypt went into decline, and Assyria suffered too. Many lands that had been ruled by the Middle Assyrian kings gained their independence, and Assyria shrank back to its heartland. But the Assyrian people didn't forget about their glorious past. In the late 10th century BCE, an Assyrian king named Adad-nirari II came to the throne. Throughout his reign, he set about reconquering the lands in Syria that Assyria had lost control of more than 200 years before. Every summer, his troops went off on campaign to fight and raid and conquer. And if a land rebelled against him, then the troops would show up again and put down the rebellion. Earlier Mesopotamian kings fought only when they needed to. Adad-nirari II started the tradition of campaigning every single year. With Adad-nirari II, we come to the period when Assyria was its most powerful, the Neo-Assyrian period. It lasted for almost exactly 300 years. Adad-nirari's grandson was one of the most influential of all Assyrian kings. His name was Ashur-nasirpal II, and he ruled from 883 to 859 BCE. Ashur-nasirpal II made a very radical decision. He moved the capital city from Ashur up the Tigris to Kalhu, which is better known by its modern name of Nimrud. It had been occupied for centuries, but it had fallen into decay by this time. Still, it was where Ashur-nasirpal wanted to live and rule. He didn't move the temple of Ashur, of course. Its home in the city of Ashur was sacred. But the Assyrian government never returned to Ashur after the reign of Ashur-nasirpal II. Assyrian architects, builders, and sculptors worked for 15 years to transform Kalhu into the most impressive city anyone could imagine. A new city wall enclosed almost 900 acres, and this urban center had 9 new temples, along with a giant pyramid-shaped step tower called a ziggurat, and several palaces. In the center of the city, Ashur-nasirpal had his workers construct a new citadel. In an inscription, he claimed foundations under it were very deep, 120 layers of brick. The city's crowning achievement was the King's Palace, which is known today as the Northwest Palace. It covered at least 7 acres, which is more than 5 American football fields. It might even have been larger, but the rest hasn't been excavated. The palace was built around 3 huge courtyards, and the king's throne room alone was 150 feet long and 35 feet wide, or 4,500 square feet. You could fit 3 medium-sized modern houses into just that throne room. The palace doors and gateways were guarded by giant stone sculptures of winged lions and winged bulls with human heads, like the ones that impressed me so much as a child at the British Museum. They weigh from 9 tons to as much as 36 tons, each one of them carved out of a single block of stone. They were there to protect the king in the palace. In a modern museum, when just one of these statues has to be moved, it often means closing the gallery for weeks or months. The Oriental Institute in Chicago needed to reinforce the floor in order to support the weight of one of these giant sculptures. Ashurnasirpal's palace had dozens of them. Mesopotamian royal palace walls had always been decorated. About 900 years before the time of Ashurnasirpal II, King Zimri-Lim of the Mari Kingdom in Syria had brightly colored paintings on his palace walls. These must have been the norm in all eras, but they've mostly disintegrated, so we don't see them. Anyway, Ashurnasirpal came up with a plan for decorating the walls of his palace that surpassed all earlier attempts. In the public areas of the palace, all the brick walls were faced with giant stone panels, made of a type of local gypsum. Each panel was as much as 14 feet in length and 8 feet high. Quarrying this stone and getting it into place would have been quite a feat. Many of the panels weigh a ton each. The panels were then decorated with elaborately detailed relief sculptures that were brightly painted. Unfortunately, the paint is long gone. Only tiny fragments of it survive. An artist must have designed all the panels and planned with the king and the priests exactly where each sculpted image would go. After the designs were sketched onto the stone, teams of expert sculptors carved the intricate images onto each block. If you get close, you can see more and more detail. Exact shapes embroidered on the clothing of every person depicted, the granulation of the jewelry, the shapes and tooling of every horse trapping. The paint on these sculptures would have made these details even more apparent. Some of the relief sculptures show the king being protected by the gods. He often has a winged genie standing behind him and a sacred tree in front of him, with a winged god hovering overhead. These weren't just for decoration. People believed that these sculptures possessed their own power and protected the king. The architects even consulted with priests to find out exactly where the protective gods should be placed. Other reliefs show life-sized images of people bringing tribute to the king. These lined the palace walls, near where actual dignitaries would have walked, bringing their own gifts. And there are lots of scenes of the king hunting lions, and of the king and his army fighting enemies. These progress like a graphic novel from one panel to the next. A visitor to the palace could follow what happened in a war by walking along beside the sculptures. The king wasn't depicted as being larger than everyone else. You can pick him out because of his headdress. It looks a little like an upside-down flowerpot. He's shown right in the middle of battle, surrounded by the army in their many victorious campaigns. Across every stone panel, even the ones that didn't have relief sculptures, there's a cuneiform inscription. This is almost always the same one. It's known as Ashurnasirpal's standard inscription, and it proclaims the king's greatness, and the support he had from the gods and the victories he achieved in battle. Of course, most people couldn't read, but the standard inscription probably wasn't designed just to be read by palace visitors. After all, why would they need to see it repeated over and over again? It was probably mostly for the gods and for the future. But centuries before this, Mesopotamian kings had stamped inscriptions on the bricks they used to construct their temples and palaces. Even though the inscriptions were covered by other bricks and weren't visible to viewers, every brick noted the king's name and the name of the building and the god it was dedicated to. No future king could falsely claim that the building was his work if every brick showed that he was lying. The stone reliefs in Ashurnasirpal's palace had the same effect. If the inscription was omnipresent, his deeds would never be forgotten, and no future king could take credit for his achievements. It worked. The stone panels ended up in at least 23 museums around the world, and every one of them proclaims Ashurnasirpal's greatness. When his palace was complete, Ashurnasirpal threw a huge party to celebrate. He invited almost 70,000 people from across the Assyrian Empire and from lands beyond the empire as well. His guests were given food, beer, and wine, and they were entertained for 10 days. No doubt they were all completely wowed by the architecture and the sculpture of the new capital city, and by the power of the Assyrian king. Among the guests, 16,000 were citizens of Kalhu itself. These people had all moved there from around the empire. Meanwhile, the Assyrian Empire had been expanding. The standard inscription, written all over the palace, describes how this was achieved, and the relief sculptures show details of tactics that the Assyrian military used for battles and sieges. The language Ashurnasirpal II used to describe himself was very different from that of some of the earlier Mesopotamian kings. He wasn't a kind shepherd to his subjects, like the 18th century BCE Babylonian king Hammurabi. He didn't try to make sure that weak people were protected from strong people, like the 22nd century BCE Sumerian king Ornama. Here's what Ashurnasirpal said about himself. He said, "He had no rival among the princes of the four quarters. He was fearless in battle, a king who subdues those insubordinate to him. He who rules all peoples, strong male who treads upon the necks of his foes, trampler of all enemies, he who smashes the forces of the rebellious." His successors followed this same model. They also described themselves as tramplers and smashers and subduers, and they increased the Assyrian military might. Soon, they had standing armies that were available to campaign year-round. They recruited men with military expertise from across the empire, so that normal Assyrian farmers weren't called up to serve anymore, though they still had to work on imperial building projects. In a way, the army became a reflection of the empire. The men spoke many different languages and carried many different local types of weapons and armor. Military divisions were stationed near the borders, ready to campaign at any time. Fighting techniques improved as well. For hundreds of years, the Assyrian army had consisted of foot soldiers and chariot soldiers. Now, the Assyrians added cavalry. The chariots got bigger and bigger, until 4 horses were needed to pull each one, and up to 4 men rode in each. After Ashurnasirpal, later Neo-Assyrian kings also decorated the walls of their palaces with relief sculptures of military campaigns, so we can see the technological advances. The reliefs often show attacks on cities. The warriors had battering rams that they could thrust against gates, with protection for the men pushing them. They look like tanks. The Assyrian attackers set up siege towers. They tunneled under city walls or sapped the walls to weaken them. They rained arrows over the walls and threw flaming torches. But sieges were long and tough and expensive, so the generals often tried to negotiate with the people of a rebellious city. If diplomacy didn't work, the Assyrians would terrify citizens by impaling prisoners on stakes in public view. And if the local population still didn't give up and physical attacks didn't work, Assyrian soldiers were willing to spend months camped around a city, until the people inside were starving and sick. So the Assyrian army was quite successful, but you can see how it wouldn't have been very popular. People in the provinces had to pay taxes and tribute. They had to fight for the Assyrian army, and they would have heard about the brutal ways the army treated rebels. In fact, the people who were subject to Assyria stood almost no chance of being able to rebel and gain their independence. The Israelites tried to break free of the empire, but their rebellions were put down repeatedly. Eventually, according to the Bible, most of the Israelites were deported to other parts of the Assyrian Empire. The Judeans saw the Assyrians as harsh oppressors. In the book of Nahum in the Hebrew Bible, the prophet wrote directly to the Assyrians. He said, "Who has not suffered your relentless cruelty?" This view was probably common among many of the conquered peoples. The whole idea of how to maintain an empire was now very different than it had been in earlier times. Kings like Hammurabi and Shamshi-Adad and Tushratta hadn't tried to terrify their subjects into submission. The Assyrians used terror frequently. On the other hand, the Assyrian army was no more brutal than the armies of some later empires like the Romans. And this Neo-Assyrian period marks an important moment in world history, because empires, truly vast and expansionist empires, became the norm for hundreds of years after this. Although Sargon of Akkad had created the world's first empire, 14 centuries before Ashurnasirpal II, the earlier empire hadn't lasted for long. Most of Mesopotamia's previous kingdoms had been city-states or territorial states, not empires. Experiments in empire building hadn't gone very well before. Also, ideas about democracy, human rights, and international law hadn't developed yet. Every state in the Near East at this time was ruled by a king. That had also been true of every state previously, even if past leaders hadn't all had the title of king. And kings ruled every state the Mesopotamians encountered, so it was obvious to them that a king was essential for running a state, just as it's obvious to us today that a CEO typically runs a large organization. In spite of the Assyrians' reputation for brutality, it was entirely possible for someone to live a happy life under Assyrian rule. Thousands of everyday documents from this era show that. The Assyrians developed a form of empire that was stable and successful, even though their tactics for ruling it shock us today. It must have seemed, after a century or so, as though the empire would go on forever.